Hello, Chemistry 10, Chemistry 10H, Chemistry 10HH students, and also potentially AP Chem and Physics 11H students. This is Mrs. Altman, and in this video, I'm going to be reviewing how to write a lab report. This will be a reference for you to refer to throughout the school year, especially if you're not getting the grades that you want to get on a lab report. All right, so I'm just going to walk through the entire thing. Feel free to fast forward to the parts that are most useful to you and also use this as a reference throughout the entire year. So I'm just going to start with the formatting. The first point is that you must use Google Docs. You cannot use a different word processor and then copy and paste it into there. That has to do with reasons of I don't want you to be under suspicion of plagiarism. I know all of you really do put a lot of effort into your work, and I want you to be 100% certain that I recognize that. So you must use Google Docs. There's also another reason that we have to use Google Docs that we will talk about later. You must submit using Google Classroom as well. That allows for me to give you the correct kind of feedback in a way that's just a little bit easier for me to give to you. You also must submit all of your lab reports to Turnitin. And then the third point, this is one that's very important and a lot of students will take advantage of, as you should. I give feedback to all rough drafts for lab reports that are submitted by Monday morning, period 1. I typically get to them a little bit later in the day, but sometime on Monday, I will grade all of the lab reports that students give me, and I will give you feedback on them so you can make corrections. If you miss that spot, you lose the opportunity to get feedback from me unless you make some sort of appointment with me for that. And then also just general formatting, your font must be Times New Roman size 12 double space. The sort of caveat to that, if you prefer graphs and tables to be single space, that is completely okay with me. If you don't know what I mean in saying that, then just make the entire thing double space. So let me just show you how to do that again, in case you hadn't known. So I have a document here. For most of you, I would recommend you make the document in Google Classroom. I can't show that here because I'm on the teacher end of things. So just change your font to Times New Roman, change it to size 12. And then for spacing, I have to click more, the up down arrows, and then double space. I would also add here, you can have your header be single space if you prefer. I'll add that here. That's just a personal preference. I'm going to do the whole thing double spaced here because if you're watching this video, it probably means that you want to do better on lab reports. So I'm just going to go with the easiest option. All right, our first section is the header. This is free points if you do it correctly. I'm going to walk through what this would look like. All right, so you're going to put your name. So I'm going to put my name. You put your name. Must be first and last. You don't have to do middle initial. I just like to. And then you're going to put the date the experiment performed. I don't care about the formatting for this. I'm just going to do it in a way that I think is easily transferable. I'm going to pretend I'm doing it today, which is August 5th, 2020. The lab reports are always due 1 week later at midnight. So if we did do a lab on August 5th, it would be due on August 12th. Then we're going to do the, you're going to write the lab title and the page number from your lab notebook. That just allows for me to see exactly where your observations were if I need to reference it. So I'm actually using a former student's lab that I have here. It's lab number 1. It was titled Density of Solids and Liquids. You'll have the title in your lab notebook, and she had hers on pages 3 through 7. I only care that you put the first page on there, so if you just did page 3, it would be 5. Then I'm just going to put up made up names here. You would put your lab partner's names here first and last names here. So then we're finished with our header. Sort of thing that a lot of students like to do here is just have a document where they have the header on it, and then they just copy and paste it each time. All right, the second section, and this is the section that trips a lot of students up, is the summary of results and observations. For the Chemistry 10 and for the Chemistry 10H class, I usually have a table in the lab sheet that we use for our lab notebook that you can copy and paste. So if you have one of those, you could just copy and paste it. But I'm going to show you what this would look like if I didn't do that. I don't actually take up points if you don't label the section for this, but it's a good idea too. So if you do need to make your own table, you do insert table. And then in this particular student's example, I need 4 rows and 2 columns. So that's what I do. And then I just put in all of her numeric data, making sure that I am including the units. If I have the milliliters here, I don't also need them here, but you can. You always want to put a space between your quantity and your unit. You might not yet have learned in class why I included that 3.0, but in general, if you have a 0.0 in your measurement, you need to include it. So every numeric measurement, by and large, should be in the table. There are exceptions to that, but it's better to include things and not need them than to have things that should be in there that shouldn't be in there. When it comes to qualitative measurement, when I say qualitative, I mean with words. Uh, if you're going to be referencing it in your post lab questions, then you should include it. So on the lab sheet that you use to fill in your lab notebook, there's typically between 1 and 3 post-lab questions, depending on which class you're in. So if you're in the 10 class, it's typically 1 or 2 questions. If you're in the HH, or AP class, it's typically 3 and sometimes 4 questions. You don't need to copy the questions. Some students like to copy and paste them over. Feel free to do so. There's nothing wrong with that. For the post lab questions, if it is a qualitative question, so for example, if I had asked for you to describe what the water displacement method is, you would need to answer that in the form of 1 or more full sentence. And then you would also need a calculation. So let's just pretend that the first question said, describe the water displacement method. So I would say, water displacement method. So what I've done here is I've listed in my own words the answer to the question. I did so in full sentences. I didn't use any sort of abbreviations in here, all of which is fine to do in your lab notebook. It's just that the lab report is not the time or place for it. In the event that you have a calculation question, you don't need to write the words for those, or there are cases where you do, but by and large you don't. And then you will type out your work. I have a slide here that has some tips on equation editor. So you're not going to need this for every single lab report, but you're going to need them for a whole lot. So I've got a couple of some commands here. A lot of students just jot these down somewhere in their just somewhere in their lab notebook just to help you remember it. So I'm going to answer the second post lab question. In this case, she was doing the density. So to get an equation, I do insert equation. Wait for it to load up. Sometimes it takes a second, especially at our school's Wi-Fi. So density is equal to mass over volume. To make a fraction, it's backslash FRAC. So backslash, not forward slash. It won't work with a forward slash. And then all of a sudden it makes a fraction. So mass, I use the right arrow to get to the bottom. I'm going to plug in her work. You don't always have to include the units with your answer, but it's never wrong to do so. And then those of you in the H class, just be mindful of sig figs with this. So when I put this in my calculator, I got 6.2 grams per milliliter. And then for the sake of having a percent error in here, I'm going to throw in a one of those as well. Backslash frac gets me the fraction. The absolute value sign is shift and then the key above the enter key, at least on my keyboard. So she was supposed to have 11.34 as her density and she got 6.2. Then I go to the right arrow to get to the bottom. And then for some of you, you might want to do the times 100 just to make it into 8%. And I got 45%. So that's a pretty high percent error, which is actually, for demonstrative purposes, a good thing. So when I get to the conclusion, you can see why. Her post-lab questions did also have some other things in there, but I'm going to leave it at that for the sake of time. Right, so this is the thing that sometimes trips students up, is writing the conclusion. So there are multiple ways to do it, but if you're watching this video, it probably means that you're consistently having a little trouble with it. That's okay. So the way that I recommend to students who are really having trouble with writing the conclusions is to always write the conclusion the same way every time. So for this particular student, there were two objectives in the first part of the lab notebook. So what I would start would be, I would have two separate paragraphs. Again, you can have some variation here, but I want to give you very clear-cut instructions for students who are having a little bit of trouble with this. I restate the objective. You can take this word for word from your objective section in your notebook. That's completely fine. You could have one paragraph if you wanted to. I'm not going to be critical about formatting, especially like sort of grammar type stuff, unless it infringes on my ability to understand you. And then what you do in one or more sentences, you explain how you did this in the lab. You have to specifically talk about how you did it in the lab and not any sort of external research. Not that there's anything wrong with including external research in there. It's just not typically what I'm looking for when I am grading it. So an example of how I would do this, how I would address this if I were this student. So this is an example of a way to address this particular objective. It doesn't have to be this long. I don't care how long it is, so long as you have all the content in there. So she restated the objective. And then she explained how she achieved the objective. So this particular objective was calculating the density. So she explained how she got her numeric. So she got her volume using the water displacement method. She had already explained it in post lab number 1, so she didn't need to explain it again. If you hadn't included this right here, it's not a huge deal, but it's a good idea too, just to make sure that you've explained yourself. She explained how she got the mass by placing it onto the scale. And then since she had a percent error value, she referenced it. Generally speaking, you want your percent error to be under 5%. So under 5% is good. Hers was 45%, which is not inherently bad if you can explain why. So she was not successful, and that is okay. Sometimes you won't be successful in the lab. Not most real life experiments are not successful. But she explained exactly why, and she gave a precise reason why. Just saying there was a rounding error is not a good enough reason. Just saying that you had not measured carefully is not a good enough reason. So she gave a specific reason. Our percent error was so high because we didn't zero out the weight of the petri dish. That's a super common mistake that students make. I will do my best to catch you making those mistakes in the lab such that you don't end up having to do this in your conclusion. But I am only one person, and then there's often up to 20 of you, so it is not always possible to do so. So if you made a mistake in the lab, it is not necessarily going to mean that you get a bad grade on the assignment if you understand your mistake. For the conclusion paragraph, as well as for the post-lab questions, it is okay if you look at external resources. I don't have any rules against them, but you cannot take any sort of direct quotes from them. If you do cite something for an idea, then you can have a conclusion. You can have a works cited section at the end. I don't really care how you cite it so long as I can find it. You don't typically need it. The reason why you don't typically need it is because you've already cited your lab report at the top in your header, so there's no need to cite it again. But if for whatever reason you did need to cite something, for example, another student's lab report, let's say if you were absent from the first lab, then you might need to cite it there, but not typically needed. If you do use a reference, though, please put it in there so that way I know that you weren't plagiarizing. I know that you just used it as a reference, which is completely fine, by the way. All right, I hope that this was useful to you. Thank you so much for watching and have a great night.